and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the official appointment of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as WTO's Director General. She will be the first ever African and woman to lead the organization. Her appointment came after the newly elected U.S. President Joe Biden decided to back her over a South Korean rival. The former World Bank Managing Director Okonjo-Iweala is expected to manage trade tensions between China and the United States and enact much-needed reforms in the WTO. Of course, those are the huge goals. Her background as the chair of Gavi and also the earlier position with the World Bank has well positioned her to overcome some of the problems when dealing with COVID-19 pandemic. So how will she do in her new job? Take a look at our discussion. For more on the latest about the future of WTO, join me in Beijing, Ju Jiandong, professor of PBC School of Finance from Tsinghua University. In Kuala Lumpur, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined. That's an international development consultancy. And joining us in New York, Max Wolf, CEO of Systematic Ventures. Ladies and gentlemen, happy Chinese New Year to all of you, and good to see all of you. Let me start by asking Professor Ju, how much new momentum will Ms. Okonjo-Iweala be able to bring?
Feel very much positively. Think WTO could have a space to bring this world back to control pandemic and bring this trade back to normal.
So one of the things she's already talking about before coming to the office on March the 1st is the task that she had. One is to work on the vaccines. The other is to work on economic recovery. Now, Mr. Wolf, for the role of Director General of WTO, to work on the vaccine seems to be quite a new one.
Yeah, but I think it's actually a great case study and an expanded possible role for a WTO that sees its mission of encouraging trade and cooperation more broadly than perhaps some folks have in the past. And I do think it's hard to imagine regrowing after a pandemic in the midst of the pandemic. And the way the vaccines have sort of been developed and begun to roll out, it's been a very exclusive rollout to a relatively small portion of the world's populations. And so if we're going to solve this problem, it has to be we who solve the problem. And I think it's a good idea to expand that mandate to every major international organization until the fire is out.
One of the brand names that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala carries, Ms. Ryder, is first women Director General and first coming from developing country. One of her nationalities is from Africa. So, Ms. Ryder, how much do you think, though, she will be able to represent Africa or African leadership? After all, she has dual citizenship.
Although she is Nigerian and she comes from Africa, she understands the African context. That is absolutely critical and really important, particularly because Africa represents a very, very small amount of global trade, and African nations have been trying to increase their share of world trade for many, many years, including through the WTO. That said, whatever however much her background, however much her citizenship, she will not be able to represent African states. She is there to represent everyone and to try and facilitate as much as possible what can be done and what's feasible within the world trade system.
Having said that, though, let's focusing on the vaccines. This is a new role, but what can Dr. Okonjo-Iweala do given her background working for Gavi?
Look, we've seen a pretty aggressive stance where the sort of usual Western countries use their relationships to pharmaceutical companies and their money to secure vast quantities of dosages for their citizens. But there's some responsibility, especially because, again, that's not how pandemics work along national lines, to make sure that the bottom 3 billion people aren't waiting 5 years for a vaccine. For many reasons, one of which is just epidemiological, right? Which is this thing will continue to evolve eventually around vaccines if it rips out of control through the global populations. And also, I would think that World Trade Organization is trying to keep an environment of international exchange and free movement of goods and services. And people who fear and shut their borders against one another rarely work together economically.
More than 100 countries have had zero doses of vaccines so far. Well, in the world, some of the richest 10 countries have most of the vaccines in the world. This is enormous amount of moral hazards, shall we say. So Professor Zhu, what can WTO play its role with the leadership of Dr. Okonjo-Iweala from your perspective?
Although it looks like vaccine is the business for WHO, but it's not. It is not only for WHO, it is a trade. So as you point out, the rich countries actually supply this vaccine and to the developing countries. So it is indeed a trade. It is indeed WTO's business. If you want to control this pandemic, you have to control it globally. That's exactly the right thing. This WTO could lead countries to work in that direction.
What she was doing when she was in Gavi, for instance, when she was on the board of the Global Alliance for Vaccines, is taking the world trade system as it is, taking the world manufacturing system as is, which is pharmaceuticals, particularly most normally produced in developed countries, certainly all the majority of research and development going on there, the budgets. What she can do now is say, well, actually, how do we shift the trade regime so that more production, for instance, can be happening in developing countries? What parts of the world trading system do we need to have to allow the poorer countries to also have just as much vaccine nationalism as the richer countries? That is the inequality here, that we do not have the capacity for manufacturing in poor countries, and this really needs to be improved going forwards. And Ngozi has a key role to play there.
Mr. Wolf, how much do you think Dr. Okonjo-Iweala and the current WTO, which has been under tremendous pressure to function, and now still facing the danger of a battleground of some major trading nations, be able to play its role? How optimistic should we be?
I think we sort of have to be optimistic right now, and I think we've actually
seen this story. Do you mean we have to be optimistic? Is it wishful thinking?
Yeah. Sometimes, but you have to sustain yourself, right? So let's hope not, right? Maybe a little pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will is called for in this moment. But look, I think we've seen this before. So I think we have many pandemics, some which will, in the big picture, be more lethal than COVID. COVID got more attention because it hit everybody, including the people who are used to thinking about pandemics over breakfast by hearing about it on the BBC, as well as people who tend to live out the everyday reality. And that there's the glorious vaccines, which are important, but there's also little boring, do you have access to medical care? And can you get PPE? Because for a lot of the world, for the short term at least, the front lines should be PPE, because there are a lot of people out there getting sick who don't need to, separate and apart from the vaccine, because they can't get a mask and they can't sterilize their hands, right? So the old problems we always had of drinking water and soap and access to some very basic materials are still everyday life-threatening issues here, especially now because of the pandemic. But I think the WTO either gets bigger, or it goes away. And so she might be the right person to take the first path, which we need to be optimistic, which is get bigger, be a little bit more inclusive, and start to look at the stakeholders in trade, not just the rule makers in trade.
Gets bigger or goes away? Professor Zhu?
This pandemic control, these major countries do have the same interest to work together. And one country, even strong like the US, it's not sufficient. As I said, even US has a problem to quickly produce enough vaccine, even supply the domestic people. So in that situations, we do need these countries like the European countries and the US and China to work together. While when these countries want to work together, you need a platform to discuss. And the WTO is exactly the platform. and the new director is exactly the right person to have these countries work together and have the to move these vaccine things on. So I think this pay attention to the vaccine. It's a very smart move.
Back in 2018, I did have the chance to speak to the now WTO Director General Okonjo-Iweala. Back then, she was chair of the board of the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, otherwise known as Gavi. She spoke to me about her journey in politics and what led to her current position. And she also discussed how her background as an African woman impacts her leadership goals. Take a listen. I see you often at World Economic Forum. You were in politics 20, 30 years ago. Now you are working on this Gavi association. But how do you see women leadership has been transforming over the years?
Well, let me say this. I've had a very I'm privileged to have had a good career. I'm actually not a typical politician. I was working at the World Bank as vice president and managing director when my country asked me to come and serve as finance minister. And I think I'm the longest serving. I did 7 years, 3 years, and 4 years. Then, so
I can tell you just love challenges.
Exactly, it's very challenging. So I think that career has something at its core, and that's service. So as a woman leader, as any leader, when you're going into leadership positions, you should be very clear why you're doing it. And for me, it is what can I do to give back to people internationally poor people. What can I do to make a difference with the training I've been privileged to have? What can I do in my country and my continent to make a difference? So that has been, and do I enjoy? If you're a leader who does not enjoy what they're doing, then you can't give your best. So I must be enjoying the job. And at Gavi now, it's a privilege to chair an organization that is delivering for the world's children.
The other thing, mainly, is about what WTO's future is going to be like. A battleground, Ms. Ryder, that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala has picked is about the vaccine. But this is as complicated as it can be. So has she picked up the right battle? And how is that likely to help WTO to streamline some of the biggest challenges it's been having over the past years?
We brought her to China in 2018 as well to speak about China's role in financing African development. Also have some meetings with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and she also worked, and I also personally worked with her over 2014, 2016, when she was chair of a global partnership for effective development cooperation. Now, in all those roles, in all the roles that she's had, the way I would describe her is both energetic and resilient. She really pushed herself towards a particular goal, and there is no doubt that WTO has some really huge challenges, well beyond those that even Professor Ju was mentioning with regards to US-China. Look, the WTO, even since 2001, when the WTO tried to launch the development round, those talks collapsed in 2008, and in particular because of agricultural subsidies challenges, which the European Union and the US had challenges in agreeing to remove. Now, developing countries have really tried to push the World Trade Organization to agree rules in their favor. This has been very difficult. And beyond the US and the China challenges, these are things which Dr. Ngozi will have to pick up and will try to pick up, I'm very sure, but she will be the right person to do that.
I'm so glad that we are not just talking about one personality anymore, because this is much beyond one person, whoever is the Director General. This is the systematic problems that WTO has to face. Now, Mr. Wolf, if you are being asked, what are some of the priorities that WTO needs to deal with right now for this year, for example?
I think it's been a very challenging year on a number of levels. I think the WTO suffers from what I would call sort of the Bretton Woods series of problems, which is it was articulated at an era that doesn't resemble the modern era as much as would be ideal, right? So it assumes a power structure, a wealth structure, a way of global operating, which are, I think, mostly for the best, associated really in our minds these days more with bygone colonial arrangements than modern realities. I think that's a bit of a burden that needs to be evolved away from. I think that the climate emergency is quite severe, and I don't think that even in these pandemic years, its impact on human life is much less than the pandemic, right? Probably also, when we eventually learn, if we do, how this pandemic entered the human population, it'll be zootropic, and it'll be about a warming Earth with people pushing into animal habitats because of strains on their material standard of living. So I don't think that even the climate challenges will probably be what's behind this pandemic if when we learn what happened here. So I don't even know if it's distinct, but I think those are pretty big. And I also think we need to figure out a way where the larger, more powerful countries, first and foremost, the one I'm from, so not throwing stones at anybody else, can be pushed to a more cooperative bilateral framework or multilateral framework. Because I think as long as the big countries pursue bilateral solutions, it's very hard for the smaller countries to feel like they can be completely confident about international organizations. I think that's an unfortunate reality of the global power structure as it presently exists.
May I follow up? You said about some of the major economies, such as China and United States. Let's talk about the U.S. a little bit, since that's where we come from. And I'll go back to Professor Zhu about China, since that's where he is coming from. So, Mr. Wolf, about the U.S., just frankly speaking, have we seen any sign that the U.S., first of all, being preoccupied domestically, secondly, in a competition mode in terms of China-U.S. relations, to say the least, will be able to work with China under this big umbrella of the World Trade Organization?
Look, I think we've seen better, but not good from the Biden administration, right? So better as in, the United States is at least gesticulating in the direction of rejoining the community of nations. And it would stretch creativity to imagine a leadership worse than what we've recently had. So by virtue of that, it'd be hard to imagine we could underperform that. I do think that we are in a nationalist moment in the US where people feel quite imperiled. They feel their prosperity is imperiled, and they have a sort of hostile disposition toward the world. I don't think it's the majority of Americans, although I would understand if most people do. But I think it's the weight of professional opinion in terms of the politicians believe that the angriest, most important voices to appease are hostile to the world, right? That very much predates COVID, by the way. But COVID obviously didn't help, but it was in place before. I do think that we have reasonable professionals running the country now, which is a major improvement, at least in the White House, although maybe not in the Congress, so it's something. And I do think the following. All American business knows that the prosperity that comes from trade and an open economy is required for them to sustain what they have now, let alone to grow. Okay, so what they tell you on TV, what they tell their fans, and what they believe, maybe this isn't such a great thing, but they're not necessarily always twins. Yeah, they might not even be familial relations. So I don't think the weight of big business would be against international trade. And I'll tell you the simple reason why. More growth will occur in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years outside the US than in the US. And if you're in the growth business, you can't ignore the growth. The end. Right. Okay. So I think that to the extent that we are a business-centric, business-run polity, that will probably eventually prevail, although it could be close and perhaps not in all matters.
Over the past few days, we have seen some new statistic put out by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has been reported widely about how much, if the U.S. goes down the road it did, it's going to hurt its business community and its global impact. However, we have also seen this new administration come in and focusing, as it claims, quote unquote, on the human rights issues. So how should we see the U.S. struggling domestically with its priorities? And how is China ready to take or to work with the U.S. at various stages when it's renegotiating within itself?
Two things will not be changed. Number one, U.S. and China will compete. Number two, US and China will be the largest and the second largest economy in the world. These two things will not change in the next 10, 20 years. We will see the competition between US and China in many fields. We will also see there will be cooperations between the firms in China and the firms in US, because you just cannot ignore the another largest market in the world. Right now, what would be the most important things could be corporations. They point out climate change and this pandemic will be the two most important things for this US. But let's remember, both things, this pandemic control and climate change, US cannot do by itself.
What are some of the areas, Professor Zhu, you are specifically looking at when it comes to WTO and even WTO's umbrella under which China, US, which direction it is moving toward? What are some of the issues you are looking most closely right now?
These member countries like US and China are too divided in this kind of business. That's the digital economy and this developing country status. I would suggest put that these member countries deeply divided, these kind of things put aside, but work on these things these member countries all agree to work on. So as I said, I think the new director actually is very smart to pick up some things these US and China actually agree to work together. Vaccine, it's a start point. And when you work on some things and using some things, let's say using vaccine and the pandemic control to bring these deeply divided big countries together, then we have a start point.
But WTO, as a world trade body, has to face some specific challenges it, in its nature, has to deal with, which is international trade. So will WTO be able to function on its real job? Ms. Ryder, I want you to come in also here to have your say.
Yes, well, I think I take a slightly different view to Professor Zhu here in terms of, and perhaps more towards yours, Chiang-Wei, in the sense of we have large economies, yes, in the world, but we have small economies in the world. And the majority are smaller economies. And this is who the multilateral system needs to work for. And if the WTO cannot show that it does, well, what is the point of multilateralism in that case? But the focus needs to be on more than just the two powers. In fact, I would suggest moving away at the beginning from the two powers discussion and focus more on what the smaller countries, the majority of the world, really needs.
Now, WTO has enormous pressure, as you may know, from other regional multilateral trade mechanisms. There's RCEP, there's CPTPP. With this pressure, will WTO really function as a multilateral trade platform?
WTO will function in the multilateral way if all member countries agree to do that.
It's going to be challenging. There is no doubt that it's going to be challenging. But we do need a multilateral system for trade, and we can make that happen.
Yeah, so I actually think that some of these multilateral institutions, WTO particularly, have a chance to get enough of the small countries together to put both the United States and China in a situation where they can't be left out, which is a little bit how the Secretary General made the maneuvers that have been made successfully in the last year and how we got the new directorship that we have, right? So if the United States and China are playing a little bit of international competitive gamesmanship here, which I think they often are, then if there's a groundswell, neither wants to be the spoiler, right? With the exception of maybe our most recent government here, but at least for the next 4 years, probably not our government here. So there is actually a way to do this. It's almost the economic Cold War way. And there's some evidence that people and constituencies inside the institution have figured that out. And I think we have a little bit of a master chess player here in the main directorship seat. So actually, I think that I'd be guardedly optimistic that we'll see much better function. And I think they don't need a lot of wins. I think 1 or 2 big wins announces to everybody that it may have been left for dead, but it's still alive and it could still be useful. And You don't need a lot of light in a dark room to get everybody's eyes to focus on you.
Yeah. You know, when we were talking to one another, I could well feel this atmosphere in the room, even though we're talking virtually, about, you know, we're all in this thinking process and groping process, try to figure out how things are and where they are going. But for now, I really thank all of you for sharing with us your insights. I really appreciate it. Hannah Ryder, Max Wolf, last but not least, Yu Jiandong. Thank you so much, and Happy New Year to every one of you.